Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. My name is Paul Holmes, Managing Director of Info by Design, and here to talk about a topic that is hopefully for those of you in the privacy area fairly sort of top of mind at the moment, talking about biometrics and particularly looking at the concept of proportionality and how we strike the right balance in the context of privacy compliance. So in terms of what we're going to cover in the webinar today, there's a few things. We're going to delve into biometric technologies and how to use them in a way that respects privacy. Obviously, they can be highly intrusive if misused, so they can enable tracking or profiling of individuals in intrusive, discriminatory, or creepy ways. But they also do offer significant benefits in convenience, security, fraud prevention. And so the focus for us today is looking at biometrics and privacy in the New Zealand context, particularly in the context of the draft Biometric Processing Privacy Code that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has been consulting on, and concepts of necessity and proportionality that sit within that draft code. We're going to talk a little bit about how to assess necessity and proportionality and some thoughts that I have around how to integrate it with your existing privacy impact assessment processes. By proportionate, in this sense, we mean the benefits of using biometrics should outweigh the privacy harms, and that's a core theme that we'll be really exploring in detail. And also just some practical steps of, my advice of what you should be thinking about now or considering from your organization's perspective in terms of how you currently use biometrics and getting things in order before the code comes into effect. So why are we focusing on biometrics now? So the use is kind of exploding, really, from unlocking our phones with our faces to agencies exploring facial recognition for security purposes. And with that growth comes heightened concern. People worry about a future where cameras track your every move without your knowing. And, realistically, we've had some high-profile incidents in this country that have raised alarms. One example from a few years ago was police briefly trialling Clearview AI, which is a controversial facial recognition tool. And that was done, without appropriate sign-off and definitely without engagement of the Privacy Commissioner, and caused quite a bit of public concern and then was very quickly stopped. Why? Because technologies like these, if they're deployed without oversight, can seriously erode privacy. They can identify people in secret and even get it wrong. And we also know, and it's been clearly proven already, that facial recognition systems have misidentified Māori and Pacifica people at higher rates in some cases due to biased algorithms based on the quality or the nature of the data that they're training on. And globally, we're seeing regulators either make comments on or take action against the use of biometrics pretty widely. In New Zealand, our Privacy Commissioner recognises that to maintain public trust, we need clear rules so that biometrics are only used responsibly and with appropriate safeguards. And that's why they're consulting on the draft Biometric Processing Privacy Code to make sure these technologies are used safely and only when justified. And that's aligning to, regulations and trends that we're seeing in other jurisdictions too. Just speaking of Clearview AI, if you haven't already, I strongly recommend that you read the book Your Face Belongs to Us by Kashmir Hill, which is a great piece of investigative journalism effectively into Clearview AI, where it came from and some of the, the risks, concerns and challenges it poses. And it's a really good, well-written way, if you're not that familiar with the risks associated with biometrics, to get your head around what it can actually mean in practice when some of these technologies are developed and used in that way. So what are biometrics? Let's ensure we're all on the same page. Biometrics are biological or behavioural characteristics that can identify a person. So your fingerprint is a classic, facial features, the pattern of your iris, even how you walk or type on a computer can actually be used with algorithms to produce unique characteristics to you. And these traits, when they're scanned by technology, produce biometric information, often a digital template or mathematical representation, which can then be used to recognize you in the future. For example, a fingerprint scanner converts your fingerprint into a numeric template and then matches it later for access control. In the draft code that's been issued, biometric information is basically defined as personal information about your physical, behavioral traits used in an automated system to identify or categorize you. So fingerprints for door access or device unlocking, facial recognition used, say, at airports or on social media for taking photos, voice recognition to confirm your identity when you're contacting your bank, even things like gait recognition, looking at how someone walks, are biometrics that can be used to identify and track or, attribute certain things to you as an individual. And why is it special? Well, fundamentally, the key thing is it's really hard to change your biometrics. So if your password is compromised or something happens with it, or your credit card number, you can change it. You can't change your fingerprint. You can't really change your face, advertently reveal things about you. So facial information can be used inappropriately to infer things like ethnicity. Gait analysis could be used to detect health conditions. And it's for these reasons that laws like the GDPR in Europe and the UK label biometrics used for identity ID as sensitive data needing extra protection. In New Zealand, our Privacy Act doesn't explicitly label biometrics as sensitive. Again, because our Act is technology agnostic, it doesn't specify biometrics as a category. So from a legal sense, there's no clear definition, but the Privacy Commissioner has emphasised that they're highly sensitive and definitely need careful handling by organisations. So while biometrics can increase security and convenience in things like unlocking your phone, they also do carry higher stakes for your privacy and significantly higher stakes in terms of recovery if something does go wrong, and the potential impacts on you as a result of that or on individuals. So there's some ethical considerations and public expectations that we really need to keep in mind when we're talking about biometric processing. So legal compliance is an interesting one. So even if something is technically legal under the current framework, we should be asking, should we be doing it? The biometrics are pushing boundaries. And just because we can deploy it doesn't mean we should. So again, looking at that, is it the right thing to do? Is it necessary? Is it proportionate? And we'll talk through in a little bit more detail kind of how to think about those. Consent is also a really important thing. So where possible, people should have a choice to participate in a biometric system. Forcing biometrics on them by surveilling everyone as they're entering a supermarket, for example, that may be seen as coercive. We've definitely seen media attention around that. And again, becomes really important if you're going to go down those paths to say, well, what is the necessity of that? Why is it important that we do this? And then how does that align? Looking at it from a discrimination perspective, unfortunately, the way that these technologies are developed, some of them do have inbuilt biases with them because of the training data that's been used to test them or develop them, as a classic example. So it's really, highly unethical and likely illegal to use a biometric system if it is going to lead to unfair bias on a particular group of individuals. There's also a psychological impact that we need to be thinking of. So, if we are constantly under surveillance in CCTV type environments, wherever we go, then that does actually have a psychological effect on people feeling that they're under surveillance. And so, again, if that becomes more pervasive, we need to think about the impact that that can have on individuals and their agency and willingness to, go about their day as they normally would. Also, from an ethical perspective, transparency and honesty are really important. Secret use of biometrics should absolutely not happen in any way, shape, or form. So being open about what you're doing, and then tying back to that legal compliance sort of point around, should we do it? If you're not willing to tell someone that you're using biometrics, then again, you should be really asking some hard questions about whether it's the right thing to do. Accountability is another important area. So how can individuals challenge or appeal decisions made either by biometric systems or using information derived from biometric systems? So we can't override basic fairness and due process based on something in an algorithm without having those key accountability checks in place. And really that all comes down to sort of that trust and social license concept. Ethical use of biometrics is about maintaining the social license to operate them. And by focusing on proportionality, respect, and fairness, ideally that builds trust with either your customers, your stakeholders, the general public, and gives you a way to continue to use them. And likewise, if you're using biometrics internally with your employees, again, you've got to have that engagement with them and they've got to trust and feel that it's appropriate. Because if you don't do it right and you don't do the right thing, then you do risk crossing the creepy line and ending up in a place where there's issues or challenge or concerns raised. So under our Privacy Act, biometrics is personal information, effectively. So the usual rules associated with personal information apply under the Privacy Act generally. So we're talking about what is required under the Act today. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, obviously the information privacy principles apply. As a few examples, if we're looking at information privacy principle 1, purpose of collection, so you can only collect personal data if it's necessary for a lawful purpose related to your functions. And this is really crucial for biometrics. You shouldn't collect fingerprints or face data unless you have a clear needed purpose. It's not okay to gather biometric information just in case. It has to be necessary for something that's legitimate. Information privacy principle 3, notification. So when you collect personal information, you have an obligation to inform the person under the Privacy Act about why you're collecting it, how it will be used, who you may share it with, etc. So again, for biometrics, you should be already telling people that you are collecting biometric information, why you're collecting it, how it will be used. So if you are using fingerprints as a mechanism for access to a building, you need to be making sure that you're telling your staff or visitors what the system's used for, how the prints will be stored, and have information available to answer any questions that they may have. One of the really important ones is IPP4. So basically making sure that you're collecting information by fair means, not intrusively or unlawfully, because obviously, biometric information is highly sensitive. Capturing it through things like CCTV aren't necessarily as overt as someone filling in a form on a website, for example. So you do need to make sure that it is, people are aware of it and you're not intruding into their personal affairs. And obviously under IPP5, you need to keep the information safe and secure once you have it. Because obviously, as I touched on before, if biometric data does get breached, the harm is high. In fact, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner have indicated that biometric breaches would almost always trigger a mandatory breach notification because there is pretty much always the prospect of serious harm to the individual. So there's no special carve-outs or specific treatment of biometric information under our Act as it says today. But the Privacy Commissioner has determined that because of the sensitivity and risk associated with the information, similar to what was done for health information, for example, it is appropriate to look at a code of practice. And under Section 32 of the Privacy Act, the Commissioner has the powers to issue a code of practice which modifies how the Act applies to specific types of information. And the code has been through consultation, 2 rounds of consultation, and is expected to be issued at some stage this year. So what is in it? The code itself. Essentially, view it as a new set of rules under the umbrella of the Privacy Act, specifically for biometric information and automated biometric systems. It's currently in draft form, and as I said, we expect a final code later in 2025. The Commissioner recognised that biometrics pose special challenges, and some areas that the consultation paper highlighted specifically are unnecessary or high-risk collection, so the risk of unchecked mass surveillance or profiling, concern about function creep as well, so data collected for one reason being used for another, which is a real concern with biometrics. Great example, we are currently scanning and using facial recognition for security purposes to ensure that our staff are safe and to avoid shoplifting. But our marketing department now wants to use them to identify VIP shoppers so a concierge can go over and spot them as soon as they walk in the door and give them better service. Again, from a marketing person's perspective, that may be a legitimate idea to have, but clear function creep from the purpose of the biometric system in terms of security. Also, there's the real concern around the lack of control or awareness. So being surveilled by CCTV without being aware of it in public spaces and having that collecting biometric information, which could be used later on. So what the code covers, so it covers essentially any automated, and stress automated, biometric system used to verify identity, identify individuals, or to classify them. So if we're using an algorithm to compare facial images, voice prints, fingerprints, anything along those lines, it applies. It doesn't cover purely manual uses of biometric information, like keeping physical photo archives. So it requires an automated system to do automated processing on the information. There are also specific exceptions for areas like health information where it would be covered already under the Health Information Privacy Code. And it really is centered, as I said, around that algorithm-driven recognition or categorization. In terms of when it applies, so once the code is finalized, it's indicated in the last consultation document that there will be a 9-month transition period for organizations to comply for any systems that are already operating. So if you already operate a system that uses biometric processing, you'll have 9 months from the date that the code is issued to ensure that you are compliant with the provisions and the requirements of the code. But it is important to note that if there is any system that you are planning to implement after the code is issued, even if it's the next day, that system will need to be compliant before it goes live. So there will be lead time, but my advice to all organizations would be start working on and start preparing now for it, because it's not something that you can do overnight. Think of the code really as raising the bar overall. It just makes some of the Privacy Act's requirements stricter for biometrics, similar to what the Health Information Privacy Code does for health information, or similar to what the Credit Reporting Privacy Code does for credit reporting agencies in terms of the information that they hold. The goal is to ensure that biometrics are only used in a targeted and proportionate way, where they truly add value, and making sure that privacy is safeguarded. And now we're going to go into some of the specific areas or concepts within the code, and then drill really deeply into necessity and proportionality. So in terms of, I guess, what we see as the key pillars of the draft code as it currently stands, so that concept of necessity and proportionality is really important. So we should only be using information if it's necessary for a clear lawful purpose and proportionate to the privacy impact. So if it's not necessary, then we shouldn't be doing it. And in this context, necessary means the biometric system actually works to achieve your stated purpose, and you don't have another reasonable way to achieve that goal. Proportionate is a balancing test where the advantage or benefits of using it should outweigh the privacy risks and harms to individuals, and we'll delve into those both in a little bit more detail. But as the OPC puts it effectively, think twice before deploying high-risk uses of biometrics. The concept of safeguards is another piece in there. You can use another word, you could use controls. Basically, things to minimize risks associated or to privacy as the result of the use of biometric processing. We'll delve into a little bit of what some of the safeguards could be later on, but they could be technical measures, organizational things like staff training. But the idea is really that by reducing the risk, that helps with that proportionality balancing and may make the overall use more proportionate. So if you need to use facial recognition for security, implementing strong data security and bias mitigation measures can lower the privacy risks, making it more likely that the benefits outweigh the downsides. Third option is around transparency and user choice, which is Rule 3 of the code, which aligns to Information Privacy Principle 3. It sets some minimum notification requirements. So basically being more prescriptive than the current requirement to inform people, and putting some clear parameters around what is expected around a notice and what is acceptable or not. So if a camera is doing facial recognition in a store or government building, there should be signage or notices that people can see before they're subject to it, if at all possible. And also, if it's feasible, offering an alternative for those who don't want to participate. So, you could introduce fingerprint scanning for office entry, but if anyone doesn't want to have their fingerprint scanned, then giving them the option to have an ID card and go through a security guard, for example. So the code really pushes strongly for that concept of a choice, which also ties into proportionality in terms of not forcing a privacy intrusive method on people if it's not absolutely needed. There are some limits on sensitive uses as well. So the code's pretty firm, and definitely the guidance is that certain uses of biometrics are kind of, a bit beyond the line. So in particular, using biometrics to deduce things like someone's race, ethnicity, health status, or emotional state. Those are considered highly intrusive and risky, and the code proposes to prohibit or tightly restrict them. So explicitly mentioned is not using biometrics to infer ethnicity. Which aligns to global trends that we're seeing as well. Europe's regulators, for instance, want to ban AI that profiles people by biometric traits like gender or ethnicity. And really that aligns to that whole sort of preventing discriminatory or deeply invasive uses of the technology. The code also upholds rights and strengthens accountability. So it doesn't remove any existing rights. People can still request their information, and Rule 6 of the code makes sure that they can get copies of their biometric data easily as a specific call-out. Also encourages, in terms of the guidance around it, organisations to be transparent about their proportionality assessments, even suggesting that summaries of them should be published if possible. So, again, being transparent, being accountable, and owning, I guess, what you're doing, making sure that you're not crossing that creepy line is really a good sort of concept to think about in terms of making sure that you are meeting the requirements of the code. So those are kind of the key concepts at a high level. We're now going to drill down further into how to actually think about necessity and proportionality in practice, which is really at the core of making decisions about whether your proposed use of biometrics is appropriate or not. So the first big question any agency should ask before deploying biometrics is, do we really need to do this? Is it necessary? And the draft code basically forces this kind of questioning via Rule 1. So in terms of applying the necessity test in practice, first of all, you need to define your purpose very clearly. What specifically are you trying to achieve? For example, we want to ensure only authorised staff can access this high security lab. Or we want to speed up customer access to our service without compromising security. If you can clearly state a lawful purpose that is connected to your organisation's functions, then that's okay. If you can't do that, then you should probably stop right there, because the IPP1 and specifically Rule 1 of the code won't really allow collection. But assuming you do have a legitimate purpose, the next step is to consider and check the effectiveness of it. So will biometrics fulfill that purpose effectively? And the code says that effectiveness should be an objective test. You need evidence or reasoning that using biometrics will actually achieve the outcome that you're wanting. For example, if you claim facial recognition will prevent unauthorized entry, you should be able to explain how. Maybe stating it's more accurate or harder to fake than ID cards. It's more administratively efficient than having a guard standing on the door, which would cause a bottleneck. But if you can't establish that causal link, or if it's more of a hunch or something that sounds exciting or interesting to use technology, then the use may not actually pass that necessity test. And we don't want people sort of, adopting technology for technology's sake. It has to be able to tangibly deliver on the goal that you're trying to achieve. And then we need to think about what are the alternatives, if any. And this is really important. Even if biometrics would work, is it the only way or clearly the best way with respect to privacy? If there's another method that's reasonably practical and less invasive, then you're expected to use that instead. For example, say you want to secure access to a confidential file system. Option A is fingerprint login. Option B is smart cards or passcodes. If option B can be implemented feasibly and achieve security nearly as well, then the fingerprint might not be necessary. On the other hand, if you can clearly prove that passcodes get shared or stolen, and fingerprints truly do solve the problem, then maybe biometrics are justified. It'll often come down to the context of what you're trying to consider. Maybe biometrics provide a leap in security or efficiency that the other alternatives don't. So I think, you've got to go through those three questions. So why do we need a biometric system? Will biometrics be effective in achieving the purpose that we're trying to achieve? And can we really say there's no feasible alternative? And if you can answer all of those positively, then you pass the necessity test. If you can't, then you should really be saying, okay, well, should we actually be proceeding with this? Or do we need to do some rethinking or redesign work to make sure that it is actually necessary to proceed. And what the code basically says is if there are reasonable alternatives that are less intrusive, then the biometric collection won't be necessary. So documenting the analysis, listing the alternatives and why each doesn't meet the goal or isn't practical, and therefore, articulating why biometrics is the necessary choice. If you can do all of that, then you can move forward from necessity, and the next test is looking at proportionality, which is a separate and additional test to apply. So if you prove the biometric system is needed, now you need to prove it's proportionate, and think of proportionality as a balance scale. On one side, there are the benefits or the needs that you're trying to achieve. Both benefits and costs could be at an individual or societal level. There's no prescription there. But what we really want to be able to demonstrate is that the benefits of the biometric system that we're proposing outweigh the risks for the deployment. And if the benefits are greater than the risks, then you can say it's proportionate and justified. If it's the other way around, then again, it may not be. So let's break it down into those kind of key areas. So privacy risks. So again, this is a privacy impact assessment process effectively. So in your existing use could impact privacy or individual rights. So some examples, there's the data breach risk if the information is compromised. And that's very harmful to people. So how harmful would it be if they were leaked, if you had facial images or fingerprints? There's the risk of unauthorized use or sharing. Could the biometric data be used later for something else? So function creep. That's a risk. And again, fingerprint or face scan. It's harder to quantify, but part of privacy, especially if people aren't given a choice. Then alongside of that, there's benefits. So we've got to be equally clear about the positives, because there are positives associated with these technologies. So there's security improvements. So you could say that the system is likely to reduce unauthorized access incidents by X%, or prevent fraudulent identities. Improved efficiency or convenience. So it could save an individual 10 minutes going through a process, or reduce queue times at an airport, for example. So those could be real tangible benefits that people want, and that we should be considering when we're looking at these things. Looking at it from a compliance or safety perspective, so making sure only certified professionals are able to access a sensitive area, improving safety. Or public interest, helping to catch a dangerous criminal or to ensure public safety at a large event. We've got to be really clear about who benefits. So if the benefits are most likely internally for us as an organisation in terms of cost saving or internal efficiency, that is a valid benefit, but it's probably less compelling in this proportionality assessment than a benefit to individuals or society. And the OPC has noted in the consultation document that an organisation's benefit alone might not carry as much weight against privacy risk. If the individuals themselves are benefiting and get a say or get a much quicker service, then that can add to the justification. And then once we've done this, there's the balancing act, and it's not a pure math. There's no specific equation that you need to apply to it. But if you look at weighing the magnitude and the importance of the benefits against the severity and likelihood of the potential privacy risks or harms, then that'll help inform you whether it's the right thing to do. So a biometric entry system is a good example that might bring moderate convenience and security. But if it introduces a high risk of serious privacy harm, like misuse of face data for other tracking, then the scale might tip against the use. But if it's expected, conversely, if you've got a biometric system that's expected to prevent major fraud or threats, and the privacy risks are minor or well mitigated, then the balance is in favour of doing it. But you don't just weigh once. So if you do that proportionality assessment and you say, okay, well, no, actually, it doesn't seem balanced. We do have some potential issues here. Then you can think, okay, well, how can we mitigate that risk? Which is where the concept of the privacy safeguards come in. So how can we reduce it? If encryption, access restrictions, and automatic deletion of data after use are applied, then the risk of a breach or misuse of information through a biometric system drops. If you perform bias testing on the system and improve its accuracy for all groups, discrimination risk drops. After putting these safeguards in place, have a look again, and perhaps if you have managed to reduce those risks, then the trade-off does come through. And really that safeguard piece is part of the proportionality equation. Now, if you get to the end of all of this analysis and it still does appear that the privacy harms or risks are higher than the potential benefits, then you probably got to actually just sit back and have a hard look at what you're trying to do and say, is it actually the right thing to do? Because there may be some times where no matter what you do, a biometric use case might just be too inherently intrusive to be able to use. So, for example, an example of that would be a city council deciding to implement live facial recognition on their full CCTV network to catch people tagging occasionally. So everyone losing anonymity in public when they're walking through the city and being under constant monitoring, that's a big privacy cost that would far outweigh the benefit of catching a few vandals who have been doing some tagging and would be disproportionate. And the Privacy Commissioner has made it really clear that biometrics shouldn't be used if they will be unjustifiably damaging to privacy. So if your assessment shows that you don't, then you have your answer, don't deploy it. But either way, document the analysis. And as the code sort of encourages, might even be something that you want to share with your stakeholders or the public to build trust. Showing them we've done a thorough assessment. This is why we believe this is justified and safe and appropriate. And so we've touched on this to a degree, but when we think about the safeguards, there's a whole heap of different types of safeguards that we could be considering. So securing the data, because obviously biometric data is a high value target for attackers. So encrypting the data both in storage and during transmission, ensuring only authorized personnel can access it with strict logging and multi-factor authentication. Consider using biometric templates, so mathematical representations of the data instead of storing the actual raw data, so images or fingerprints, etc. Storing a hash instead. And again, all of these things can help to minimize the risk of a breach and the risk if there is a breach. Obviously, data collection minimization is really important. So only collect what you truly need. If you're doing facial recognition to unlock doors, maybe you don't need to store a full high-resolution photo, just the encoded face vectors. Don't collect extra personal information along with the biometrics unless you absolutely have to. And also make sure that you've got really good and clear data retention periods and automate deletion wherever possible. So if you enroll someone's biometrics for a service, remove it when they're no longer with the service. If you're doing facial recognition to identify, trespassed individuals, don't store the footage and the pictures and everything else that you've kept. Purge it as you need it once it's confirmed that there's no one of concern there. That also aligns to the requirements of Information Privacy Principle 9 around not keeping information for longer than you need to. Making sure internally that you've got really strong controls around purpose and function creep. So if it's biometric information, it absolutely needs to be ring-fenced and needs to be restricted to use for the original purpose only. If you want to start trying to expand usage, then you need to go through full reassessment of it, full new necessity and proportionality analysis, and then change, what you're telling people about it, etc. And the code indicates it will outright forbid certain repurposing, like using biometrics for marketing or profiling in certain ways. So lock it down, make sure it's only there for its original intent, and don't share it with third parties unless the individual knows and it's necessary, because obviously once it's with a third party, then you have less control over what other uses they could use it for. Definitely making sure that you've got really strong bias and accuracy checks, particularly around things like facial recognition, because the known issues with some of the accuracy there, and making sure that those checks are on a representative population. So having an American software vendor selling you their facial recognition system saying it works fantastically over here and we've got high rates of accuracy doesn't mean that that will be as accurate in the New Zealand context. So it needs to be context-specific validation for that. And that's the only way that you can really ensure fair and reliable performance for everyone, reducing the risk of harm. and making sure that people aren't misidentified. And if you're doing that, then regular audits should also be part of your maintenance. The other thing that's really clear is that you need to have human oversight. So no biometric system should operate on autopilot for consequential decisions like arrests, firing an employee for time clock fraud, etc. You always need to have a human in the loop who can override or double check the system. For instance, if a facial recognition system flags someone as a banned person entering a store, have security staff verify the identity rather than immediately ejecting the person. Because human common sense can catch obvious errors. This is clearly not the same person. The AI made a mistake. And it also provides accountability. There's a person responsible for the final decision, not just a computer said so. So that's a really important thing to consider, is what human oversight will be in place. And I guess the other one is around transparency measures and choice. So it's both a legal requirement under Information Privacy Principle 3 and the proposed Rule 3, and a safeguard, because if you're informing people, then you're giving them a chance to consent, if optional, or at least be aware of and exercise their rights. Okay, well, I won't go into that building because I don't want to go through their facial recognition system. So clear signage saying this building uses facial recognition for security, see front desk for more information. Things like that go a long way. Having a public-facing privacy notice, and I don't mean in 8-point font at the bottom right-hand corner of your web page if someone scrolls right to the bottom. Explaining the system can also build understanding and trust, and make sure that you can actually answer the questions that people might have. So by implementing these types of safeguards, you reduce the privacy downsides and strengthen your justification that we are handling this responsibly. And many of these safeguards will likely be in the final guidance that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner releases rather than in the code itself, because the code won't be prescriptive. It will require you to go through and consider what's appropriate and proportionate based on the nature of what you're trying to do. But yeah, I would say, my view is that you should be treating having those in place as essential practices and a core part of what you would be doing if you are doing any biometric processing. So when we're thinking about this, there's a close alignment between what's required under the code in terms of a proportionality assessment and what you should be doing as a privacy impact assessment anyway. So my recommendation, if you're looking at this, is to look at how you can update your PIA templates to include an assessment of necessity and proportionality. And I would actually posit for most organizations, it's probably something that you should have in all PIAs, regardless of whether it's looking at a biometric system or something else, because even if it's not biometric information, if we're doing something that has potential privacy risk or harm, we should always be ensuring it's necessary and proportionate to meet the requirements of Information Privacy Principle 1 anyway. I recommend having the proportionality or necessity and proportionality assessment as a summary section at the start of the document before the detailed analysis is presented, because it's kind of that first hurdle. But I would recommend that you undertake the analysis through your PIA to identify privacy risks and safeguards, and that will inform what you actually end up having in that summary section in terms of the proportionality assessment. The code also encourages periodic reviews of proportionality assessments based on risk. So that's something that probably needs to be tidied up and enhanced within most organizations. Most organizations that we've seen or work with who run PIAs still don't treat them as a living document. So they're often done and then put into a filing cabinet somewhere and forgotten about. What the code is saying in relation to biometrics is that's not good enough. You're going to need to periodically review them. So it could be an annual review, for example, to make sure that the risks and the safeguards and everything else are still valid and that the proportionality does actually still stack up. So looking at basically defining that periodic review process and how you're going to administer that is a really important step to take. And I would say, or my advice would be, if you're having that conversation internally within your business, look at that as a way to say, okay, well, we should actually just be reviewing our privacy impact assessments on a regular basis to ensure that privacy risk is still understood and managed. Because that does then have the benefit of making your PIAs a living document and making sure that they are current, up-to-date and accurate. The reason that I suggest having the proportionality assessment as a summary section is because the code does have some expectations around making the proportionality assessments available or being more transparent. So having them as a separate summary section means that they can easily be extracted and published, either in full or as a summary as required. And again, having the conversation internally as part of this process, I would, encourage you to talk to your colleagues about whether it's appropriate to start thinking about publishing your privacy impact assessments more generally. Because again, good privacy practices help to engender and support trust and confidence in an organization. And publishing things showing that you are doing assessments and taking things seriously can help do that. And just a last few practical steps to consider before we jump into answering some of your questions. And these are things that I think you should start doing now to be across what is going to be impacted by the code and be as ready as possible when the code is published. So the first, build an inventory of the collection and use of biometrics in your organization. So do a stock take of what you're doing now. So do you use CCTV, making sure you understand are you using facial recognition? Are there any other, access systems like fingerprint, iris scanners, etc. that you're using? So make sure that you have a clear catalog or inventory of what those are. In parallel with that, I would say you should start looking at developing an internal policy for the collection and use of biometric information, which could be a supplement to your existing privacy policy. So making it clear what is acceptable and permitted uses of biometrics within your organization, what aren't, and having some of those policy requirements around a proportionality assessment, necessity, privacy impact assessment, etc., need to be completed as part of it. So start the work on developing that policy now so that you can have it ready when the code comes into force. Make sure use the code coming out to start training and raising awareness within your organization, particularly your technology teams, who are probably going to be the ones who are going to ask to be enabled this and can be kind of your partner and your gatekeeper in terms of whether it's right or not. Start engaging your internal and external, where appropriate, stakeholders now. Engage them early and often. Let them know this is coming. Let them know that we're going to need to be ready for it, that it's going to require process, and start the work and start the discussions around, budget, funding, effort, etc. Obviously, to keep across major legal developments and international trends generally, because that just helps you stay informed. And particularly if you're working with your technology team, try to build transparency into your systems as a design principle. So how can we make sure that we can make this understandable for people? How can we be transparent about what we're doing? And lastly, assume generally that any use of biometrics that you make will be subject to scrutiny, and make sure the business is comfortable with, being able to tell people what you're doing. If you're not willing to tell your customers about what you're doing or what you're processing in terms of biometrics, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. And I guess that's really the key part of it. Biometrics can deliver great value, but with great power comes great responsibility. By rigorously assessing proportionality and embedding respect for privacy and cultural values in your approach, New Zealand organisations can harness biometric technology safely and with public trust. And it's going to be an ongoing journey. So continue to learn from each other and keep mindful of global developments in this space. And obviously, the fantastic resources that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner are providing in terms of the guidance around it will be really useful for that. So now we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. Apologies again for the slight technical difficulties before. But yes, I'm just going to run through some of the questions here. So the first question, who would you report psychological impact to? So I guess this is in the context of, surveillance having a potential impact on individuals, etc. So there's not necessarily really a need to report it per se, but it's something that you should be considering in terms of the technology. Is it likely to have an impact on individuals in that sense? And if so, what? And make sure that's documented as part of your analysis. Second question, if your walk is considered biometric, what about your driving style? I don't actually know whether anyone's building driving style biometric systems, but it wouldn't surprise me. And I think that's why the way that the code is drafted and I guess the way that our Privacy Act is drafted more generally is really kind of technology agnostic in terms of it doesn't specify particular things. The guidance will give examples. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if things like driving style could be considered biometrics later on, just like your gait in terms of walking or your way that you navigate and use a computer or type can be as well. Next question, would you consider iPhone Face Unlock or Windows 11 Hello Face Unlock on work-provided devices something to declare in your privacy policy, or is it limited to the privacy policy of Apple or Microsoft? I mean, again, you've got to look at, okay, well, it's a use of biometric technologies. So if you as an organization are using them, then you should be thinking, okay, well, what are the potential risks? So looking at the technical documentation from Apple or Microsoft around how it's used, where the data is stored, what the controls are, etc. Making sure that you're satisfied that that is appropriate and proportionate, and then making sure that you provide sufficient context to your staff members to help them understand that, and then possibly even giving them the choice of whether they use it or not, because it does offer a security and efficiency benefit. But again, needs to be looked at in the light of the code. Next question, what is the likelihood of, I assume, facial recognition public perception survey being conducted in New Zealand like they did in Australia in May 2024? I don't know. I mean, it would be really interesting to see, and it would be really interesting to see if there's differences between the two jurisdictions. So if anyone on here is an academic researcher or interested in the area, in the topic, then I think, would be a great suggestion to consider. Next one, we know posted signage is wholly inadequate for gaining informed consent. Will digital signage or alternative measures for informed consent be included in code? So the code will place the requirement on the agency to ensure that whatever notice or signage they're using is adequate, and consider that as part of their proportionality. It won't specify details of what you need to do. But again, having a sign somewhere by itself with no other information is probably not adequate. So really sitting back and thinking about it. And I know the guidance that the office has produced has some examples in there of what they're kind of considering as being appropriate or adequate. So definitely have a look in there if you haven't already. Next one, everything you've covered points to supermarket surveillance being something that should not be allowed. Can you comment on that particular example? The collection seems far more intrusive than it needs to be and is similar to your example of council CCTV footage. Collection to catch taggers. We have examples of the data being leaked, it causing harm, etc., yet it continues. So I'm not across the details of the specific controls and safeguards that are in place on the trials that are being conducted here. So I'm just talking in terms of my, perspective from a professional view. Again, you'd expect that they would have gone through understanding what the particular, risks that they're trying to mitigate are and do that proportionality assessment. And I know that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has obviously been, clearly across the foodstuffs trial in particular. So I can't comment on the specific details of it, but I absolutely agree that, I would be really interested in seeing the published proportionality assessment of that particular instance and what conclusions that they drew. How do we trust organizations if the evidence of effectiveness is not publicly accessible? Again, exactly that transparency point. It's really hard to build trust if you can't clearly demonstrate to people that you are trustworthy and what you're doing is the right thing in the right way. So I think, you don't have to trust it. It's definitely valid to ask the questions. And the onus is really going to be on organizations to prove that they are trustworthy and do things in the right way. Biometrics being used to authenticate customers, but also used to customers' emotive states, e.g. vulnerable customers needing additional support, etc. Thoughts about the guidance and this. I guess there's a couple of lenses to this. So if you are looking at something like gait analysis and identifying that someone has a disability that needs additional support, could you say that that's a valid use if you have a mechanism to provide someone with additional support? Potentially. I think Emotive states, in terms of emotional stuff, is pretty much in the code and the guidance viewed as a no, don't do it. So yeah. So again, I think if it's getting into that, trying to infer someone's emotional state, it would be just to stay away from that. Don't do it. If it's more something about providing specific support to someone who may need it to be helped to navigate something, then it may be appropriate, but again, would require a lot of thought and making sure that you do that appropriate proportionality and necessity assessment first. What's your view on a bio feature, alphanumeric code, being biometric information for the purposes of IPP/Rule 6? Well, it is personal information because it does align to and is attributable to an individual. It's kind of like a cookie on a browser. It may not have someone's name and address attached to it, but it still is something that can be used to attribute someone and track their behavior or activities over time. So yeah, it is biometric information for the purposes of IPP/Rule 6. So would need to be made available to someone on request if they request it. The utility of that for them, probably questionable, but still it is information that you hold about them and they have the right to know that and to be able to see what that information is. I think it would also be challenging for them on the IPP7 side to try and request correction to that. But again, it'll be interesting to see how those things play out over time. I guess my overarching point would be if you're putting in one of these systems that does these things, you need to make sure things are extractable so you can meet your obligations there. You mentioned that an example of that offering swipe cards to enter premises as providing choice to an individual instead of entering using fingerprinting. However, as swipe cards is a less privacy invasive alternative, wouldn't this mean that in your example fingerprinting should not be used in the first place? Yes, unless you can clearly demonstrate that you have had a number of security incidents relating to swipe cards being misappropriated, for example. So if you have been able to demonstrate that you have ongoing security concerns that mean that swipe cards are not adequate, then you may say we need to go to a more secure mechanism. Also, it's probably not feasible to say we need to use fingerprints across our entire building, but if you have a highly confidential lab or something along those lines that needs to be really secure, then it may be swipe card for the general building, fingerprinting just for the highly secure area. What's my take on facial recognition enabled Meta Ray-Bans? Atrocious. Please don't anyone buy them ever. What are some examples of types of information which are not biometric but health information? I understand this includes heart rate, etc. Yeah, so yes, so heart rate, other characteristics like that are health information rather than biometric. The important thing to note there, though, is the exception only applies to health information being processed by a health agency that is covered by the Health Information Privacy Code. So if you are not a health agency and you are collecting heart rate information on an individual, then that would count as biometric information potentially that would be covered by the code. So that's a really important distinction to make, is that the health information carve-out only applies to health agencies and only where it's covered by the Health Information Privacy Code. Do you need to proactively advise the Privacy Commissioner regarding your proportionality assessment? There's nothing in the guidance so far that I've seen that says that. And I don't know whether the Commissioner will provide some further guidance on that. My view would be if you are considering something that is quite high risk or quite pervasive, then it may be worth contacting the Privacy Commissioner to, advise what you're proposing to do and potentially seek some of their advice on it, or potentially, come out to organizations like us. But yeah, I think that's definitely a valid question, but I wouldn't send the OPC every proportionality assessment that you do because they will be absolutely inundated and they're not resourced to cater for that. Why will the code only cover automated collection, processing, storage of biometric data? There's some information in the original consultation documents about that. Generally speaking, I think what they're concerned about is algorithms using biometric information to infer or make decisions on people. Something like having a copy of a headshot of someone on the staff intranet so that people know who their colleague is. Again, not the same level of risk associated with that. So yeah, cool. All right. Well, I think we've pretty much hit time. I just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone for joining today. I hope you've got some value out of it. Apologies for the slight technical difficulties there. I'm sure OPC can fantastically edit them out or not. Either way, it doesn't matter. And yeah, if you do have any questions or comments, or there's anything that you wanted to drill into because I didn't get to your question in time, feel free to get in touch. My contact details below, and the slides will be circulated by the OPC in due course. Thanks, everyone.